morning of September 29th, 1982, Maggie Thompson barely noticed the dull ache at the base of her skull. A long day at the office, a nagging headache, it wasn't anything a couple Tylenol couldn't fix. She rifled through the kitchen drawer, pulled out the familiar white bottle with its red cap, twisted it open, swallowed 2 capsules with a swig of water. By the time she settled on the couch with her book, a strange wave of nausea rolled over her. Her vision blurred at the edges, her heartbeat felt sluggish, then erratic. Panic gripped her as the room spun, her body growing heavier with each breath. She barely registered the glass slipping from her fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor before darkness swallowed her whole. Maggie's roommate Sarah had been in her bedroom when she heard the glass shatter. At first, she assumed Maggie had just dropped something and would clean it up herself. But when she called out and got no response, a sick feeling crept up her spine. She rushed into the living room to find Maggie slumped over the couch, her eyes partially open but unfocused. Maggie looked at her and said, "Maggie, Maggie," then shook her gently, then harder when she got no response. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin had taken on an unnatural whitish tone. Grabbing the phone with trembling fingers, Sarah dialed 911. "My friend is unconscious. She's not responding. I don't know what's wrong with her." Paramedics arrived minutes later, quickly assessing the situation. There were no signs of trauma, no obvious reasons for Maggie's sudden collapse. They checked her vitals. Her pulse was weak, her blood pressure alarmingly low. "Possible toxic exposure," one paramedic murmured to his partner as they lifted Maggie onto the stretcher. "Could it be an overdose?" the other asked. "It doesn't seem likely. There's no paraphernalia, nothing out of the ordinary." Sarah stood frozen in the doorway as the ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing. Something about this felt deeply, horribly wrong. Welcome to the Smoking Sun. If you enjoy true crime and dark stories, be sure to like and subscribe for more videos just like this one. Now, let's get back to the story. That afternoon, Dr. Thomas Kim had been on call for 16 hours at St. Mary's Hospital in Chicago when he heard the radio call come in. A young woman had collapsed at her home. He sighed, rubbing his temples. Another emergency. It was well past midnight, and the shift was supposed to end in a couple hours, but something about the urgency in the paramedic's voice made him stay. Dr. Kim was well respected in his medical field, an internist with an expertise in toxicology. Over the years, he had become somewhat of a specialist in rare, mysterious illnesses. He had always been drawn to cases that didn't add up. It wasn't just his training, it was his instinct to follow the path that others missed. He stood up from the nurse's station, moving towards the emergency intake as the paramedics wheeled in their patient. Maggie was unconscious, breathing shallowly, her face pale. As the nurses got her onto a bed, Dr. Kim leaned over her chart. "What do we know?" he asked. "A young woman, 29, found unconscious at her home," the nurse replied. "No history of medical problems. Roommate said she took Tylenol for a headache earlier, but didn't mention anything else. No signs of trauma." Dr. Kim's frown deepened. "Tylenol? That's it?" The nurse nodded yes, but her symptoms don't add up to an allergic reaction or an overdose. It's like something inside her body is shutting down. His gut told him it wasn't going to be a simple case. He glanced over at the paramedic, who was still hanging around waiting for orders. "Do a full tox screen just to be sure. Start an IV and get her on oxygen. We need to stabilize her first." As the nurses moved to follow his orders, Dr. Kim remained by Maggie's side, carefully monitoring her vitals. There was something so wrong about the way she looked, something he couldn't put his finger on just yet. It wasn't until hours later, after Maggie was stabilized and moved to a private room, that another case came in. Linda Caldwell, who was 34 years old, was found unresponsive in a room in Arlington Heights. Dr. Kim's heart sank. this wasn't a coincidence. Meanwhile, across the city, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up feeling unwell. Her parents, concerned for her daughter's fever, gave her one extra-strength Tylenol capsule before sending her back to bed. Within an hour, Mary collapsed in the bathroom, gasping for air. Her father found her unconscious and called 911, but by the time she reached the hospital, it was too late. Mary was pronounced dead. Her parents felt unimaginable grief, unable to comprehend how a simple pain reliever had taken their child's life. The very next day, multiple patients across the Chicago area had been rushed to hospitals, all presenting with the same symptoms. The common denominator? Extra-strength Tylenol. By that evening, the connection had become undeniable. The deaths were linked. Authorities, now working with the Illinois Department of Public Health, issued an urgent warning. Do not take Tylenol until further notice. Grocery stores and pharmacies across the city began pulling Tylenol from their shelves. Meanwhile, families of the victims struggled to make sense of what happened. Maggie's parents, Robert and Ann Thompson, were in shock. Their daughter had been a healthy, vibrant woman. How could a simple painkiller have stolen her life? James Caldwell, now widowed, had to explain to his daughter Emily why her mother wasn't coming home. Mary Kellerman's parents, devastated and seeking answers, pleaded for justice for their child. The public outcry grew louder. People feared a citywide poisoning, but the question remained, who was responsible? The next morning, the Chicago Police Department and the FBI launched a full-scale investigation. Testing confirmed that the Tylenol bottles retrieved from the victims' homes contained a deadly dose of potassium cyanide. Authorities traced the contaminated bottles back to multiple grocery stores and pharmacies in the Chicago area, meaning the poisoning did not occur at the factory. The conclusion was chilling. Someone had purchased the bottles of Tylenol, tampered with the capsules by adding cyanide, and returned them to the store shelves. The FBI set up a task force of 100 agents combing through receipts, surveillance footage, and store inventories. The search for a suspect seemed impossible. There were no fingerprints, no obvious connections between victims, or no eyewitness accounts of someone tampering with the bottles. Investigators were staring into abyss, searching for a ghost. While the FBI worked tirelessly, Johnson & Johnson took immediate action. The company issued a nationwide recall of all Tylenol products, over 31 million bottles, at a cost exceeding $100 million. Despite the financial losses, their priority was clear: public safety. Meanwhile, Chicago police detectives Mark Reynolds and Lisa Carter were following any leads they could find. They conducted interviews with store clerks, reviewed pharmacy security footage, and fielded tips from panicked citizens who swore they had seen suspicious activities in drugstores. Then a crucial break arrived. A letter was sent to Johnson & Johnson headquarters. The handwritten note was short, direct, and chilling. Gentlemen, as you can see, it is easy to place cyanide into capsules sitting on store shelves. If you want to stop the killing, wire $1 million to the following bank account. The letter was signed with an alias, Robert Richardson. It contained specific instructions for the ransom payment, including the name of a Continental bank account in Chicago. Johnson & Johnson executives immediately turned the letter over to the FBI. Investigators knew they had their first real lead. The letter was the only tangible link to the person behind the poisonings, or at least someone with the knowledge of them. The FBI quickly traced the bank account listed in the letter. It didn't belong to someone named Robert Richardson. It was linked to a man named Frederick Miller McKay, a Chicago-based executive who had nothing to do with the case. Investigators were puzzled. Why would the sender of the letter provide a real bank account belonging to an unrelated individual? They soon discovered that the account had once been used by James William Lewis, a man with an extensive history of fraud and extortion. Lewis and his wife had previously lived in Chicago, but had relocated to New York City. The FBI immediately placed him under surveillance. Lewis was no stranger to law enforcement. He had previously been arrested for check fraud, mail fraud, and embezzlement. He was known for being intelligent, manipulative, and willing to go to extreme lengths to scam people. Authorities suspected he might be exactly the kind of person capable of committing a crime as cold-blooded as the Tylenol poisonings. On October 13, 1982, just 2 weeks after the first deaths, FBI agents arrested James William Lewis in New York City. They searched his apartment and seized numerous documents, including handwriting samples and typewriters that could be compared to the ransom note. But as investigators began to interrogate him, one massive problem emerged. There was no direct evidence linking Lewis to the actual poisonings. Authorities charged Lewis with attempted extortion rather than murder. Without physical evidence, there was no way to prove he had handled the poisoned Tylenol bottles. No cyanide was found in his possession, and he had no direct ties to any of the victims. His wife, Leanne Lewis, provided an alibi, stating they had moved to New York months before the poisonings began. Despite these challenges, prosecutors worked tirelessly to make the case against him. The FBI already determined that the typewriter used to create the extortion letter matched the typewriter found in Lewis's home. However, sending an extortion letter wasn't the same as committing mass murder. James William Lewis was convicted in 1983, not of murder, but of attempted extortion. He was sentenced to 13 years in prison. While law enforcement officials never stopped considering him a prime suspect, they lacked the forensic evidence needed to convict him for the actual killings. To this day, no one has been convicted for the Tylenol murders. As the investigation continued, Johnson & Johnson took unprecedented action. CEO James Burke made the bold decision the company would recall every bottle of Tylenol in circulation, costing them more than $100 million. Rather than letting the scandal destroy them, Johnson & Johnson used the tragedy to set a new standard in consumer safety. The company introduced tamper-proof packaging, foil seals, and child-proof caps. This revolutionized the pharmacy industry, and today, every over-the-counter medication sold in the U.S. follows these safety measures. Decades later, the Tylenol murders remain unsolved. Dr. Kim, forever haunted by the case, continued his career in toxicology, helping to develop new methods of detecting poisons in emergency medicines. Detective Mark Reynolds, who had worked tirelessly to track down the killer, retired without ever seeing justice for the victims. Families of the deceased were left without closure. Maggie's parents, Robert and Ann Thompson, became advocates of consumer safety laws, hoping no other family would experience the horror they endured. Mary Kellerman's parents never stopped asking questions, pleading for answers that never came. James William Smith served 12 years in prison. Several years later, on July 9th, 2023, more than 40 years after the cyanide-laced Tylenol deaths, Smith would be found unresponsive in his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He died at the age of 76, and possibly the answers of the poisoning dying with him. Despite advances in forensic science, no new evidence had emerged to solve the case. Every time someone opens a bottle of medication and peels back the foil seal, they are unknowingly experiencing the legacy of one of the most chilling, unsolved crimes in American history. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this one. And as a side note, much of everything told in this story was true. There were some fictionalizations for dramatic purposes. With that being said, thank you for watching this video, and as always, see you next time.